Good morning, folks. Thanks for joining us. My name's Dave McGrail from Xalient. I'm here with Ido Halevi from Silverfort and Stephen Amstutz, also from Xalient. Thanks for joining, guys. Here to have a conversation about Agentic AI, about identity, about the impact of Agentic AI from a cybersecurity perspective, and what organizations can do to prepare, what steps they might take, and any advice that we might be able to offer kind of from that perspective. So folks, again, thanks for joining us. Firstly, I think, it's important that we kind of get to a common understanding of what Agentic AI is, what makes it different from kind of that original kind of machine learning and the evolution through to generative AI and onwards to agentic. So, Ido, from your perspective, what's that journey looked like, and what do you see the key differences being, and what would you give as your definition of agentic?
Yeah, so if you think about it, we started from a very native algorithms that can do stuff based on rules or rules engines, where then we advance into different types of machine learning modules. And the latest thing that we see is that we give kind of a degree of autonomously to the AI. And I think when you're talking about agentic AI, that's on the higher spectrum of this degree of autonomy.
So agentic AI has agency then, in fact, so it can act on behalf of a user.
Exactly. You can think of it as almost as an algorithm that instead of you defining the steps or the rules, you give it a goal. It, of course, uses an LLM. It uses specific types of tools. Those are the interactions that it can do with different things in your environment. It has a memory. And instead of generating an output, it can generate something that is more meaningful, like a report, right? Instead of just a quick answer.
Stephen, perhaps you can add to that in terms of your delivering kind of agentic AI within Xalient. And so we're talking about also access to tools and real world access. So how would you add to that?
Yeah, exactly. I think a lot of people still have in their mind kind of that chatbot kind of interface you have with an LLM, and really an agent is kind of advancing that a fair bit. So Ido talked about access to tools and so on, and also moving away from what was a very deterministic algorithm where you had to predetermine steps that would be taken to respond to something that becomes more probabilistic, where you don't necessarily have to have seen whatever scenario of events before to come up with a proposed response to that. The other thing I'd add is, again, around this chatbot idea, we see agents as forming part of what would have been a function within a piece of software. So agents can act on behalf of users to do certain things, but when you have them acting as a function, they are kind of operating autonomously, and therefore from an identity perspective, they need to have their own identities as well, so that you can track them from a logging perspective, you can control what they have access to from a permissions perspective, and it really kind of brings a lot more kind of complexity into how you build that agentic framework kind of from the foundations upwards. And you don't just add identity to it, you kind of have to have identity in mind from the very start.
There's some interesting bits to unpick there, particularly around identity, and we'll come back to that in a little while. But so in terms of use cases, let's try and bring that to life then. So, can you maybe give us some examples of how people might be using agents in the workplace?
Yeah. So I think what we've seen talking to many, many different practitioners is that developers are usually the early adopters, and that's where you see the first use cases and the first adoptions. And you can see that with the adoptions of tools like Cursor or Cloud Code, right? And then comes all the lovables and stuff like that. And I think going back to the identity perspective, if you think about a developer, the main interaction that the Copilot agent that it's using will probably be GitHub or Jira from handling tickets, right? And suddenly you can see things like we have this bug that usually takes, I don't know, a day or 7 days just to investigate and understand what was the root cause. And with agentic and those tools, you can suddenly reduce that time into a matter of an hour. But it all relies on giving the agents the access and the ability to perform access or investigations on behalf of the developers. Those are usually the first use cases that we see. I think the more that we'll trust the agents or the output of the LLMs, the wider the use case are gonna be,
Yeah.
and the more visionary they will look to us, if it makes sense.
Absolutely. It's an interesting point because there's a couple of key things you mentioned there. So what are you giving the agent access to, and how much do you trust what it's bringing back for you and the impact that it's having? So what I'm hearing there is people are using it to kind of automate perhaps mundane kind of analysis type tasks, to be able to go and work through some data and do some analysis that typically they might have had to do via 2, 3, 4 iterations of their own work. There's some that they can use an agent to go and do that on their behalf and bring that back, right? Okay, cool. So Stephen, from your perspective and in terms of the implementation that you're working on at the moment, how are you are there any similarities there in terms of what you're working on?
Yeah, definitely. So from a software development perspective, using the tools Ido was talking about is something that's kind of brought a lot more productivity to our developers. And it's interesting because the industry started doing that kind of with non-developers suddenly being able to develop, and the whole idea of vibe coding kind of came around. And that's kind of morphed over as it's evolved. It's morphed into what's called now context engineering. And I think that's really important because it's all about the context you give a tool and the quality of that context. So from a development perspective, almost treating the tool as an intern and giving it all the information it needs, and getting it to work on a step-by-step basis to kind of work through things. So that's kind of one strand we're working on in Xalient, where we're kind of augmenting our developers, and they're becoming a lot more productive through that. The other strand is on the observability side. So where we're providing managed services for various infrastructure components, really being able to utilize all of the context that's available. So as a human, when you're looking through, whether it's log files or you're looking at graphical data or whatever you're looking at, it's very hard to kind of absorb all of that, those huge volumes of information. And that's where Agentic AI can be really useful in bringing that all together. So they're the two main areas we're looking at.
That's helpful. Thank you. And so to the thing that comes to mind then as we talk about an agent perhaps reviewing and having access to log files, or to go and interrogate platforms, there has to be a consideration there, and you touched on it already from an identity perspective, but from a wider cyber security context, there's potentially two sides of this. Well, not potentially, there are two sides of this where we can use agentic AI for good in terms of productivity and efficiency and business outcomes. But equally, we're seeing people use agentic AI for more kind of nefarious purposes to attack organizations. And that's from a cyber perspective. But also, let's move kind of more into that identity context that you mentioned earlier, Stephen. So Ido, from your standpoint, what are you seeing in terms of agentic AI and the way it's being used to compromise?
Yeah. So I totally agree with Stefan that bringing the right context is super important for agentic AI. And what I see is, first, there is a lot of pressure on the teams to adopt AI as quick and as much as they can, right? And that context is very, very, very important to the situation that we are at, right? And you can add on top of that the barrier of building agentic AI is lower and lower. Some people might even say that English becomes the next programming language, right? And you see, and what it does is that it brings a lot of builders, new types of builders inside your organization. And with that, the opportunity is extremely high, but also the risks increases, okay? And I think when we think about the identity perspective, the pillars might stay the same. Okay, you need to take care of your basics, right? You need to discover all your AI agents, right? You need to first treat them maybe as a first-class citizens, right? In terms of identity, you need to discover them, you need to monitor them, You need to assess and profile, you need to understand how to act. And I think one thing that we can be sure is that you need those basics to be strong and solid so you can react to the unknowns and the knowns challenges that are coming with this technology and the pace of development in that area.
Okay. So, interesting point you made there around perhaps AI traditionally would have been managed and would have lived in the IT realm, but the reality is it's now shifting outside of that boundary, and shadow IT and shadow AI can be something that can create risk for an organization. And so from a discovery perspective, that's interesting, because if we come back to if is going to take action on behalf of a human, then it needs to be leveraging an identity in order to do that. So, Stephen, you touched on it before in terms of it needs its own identity as well as perhaps to consume the identity of the person that's been interacting with that agent.
Yeah, exactly. Where an agent's acting autonomously, I guess it's a little bit simpler in the agent has an identity. It's a non-human identity, and you treat it as you would most of your other non-human identities, and it has its own permissions to go and do what it needs to do. And ideally, those permissions are scoped to the role of that agent. But where an agent's acting on behalf of a user, we've seen a few extensions recently to the OAuth protocol where you calculate a joint permission based on not just the agent's identity, but also the identity of the user the agent's acting on behalf of. And then when the agent, whether the agent's accessing memory or whether the agent's accessing a tool, those joint permissions are then used to understand exactly what that user's allowed to do with that tool or what that user's allowed to see inside that memory.
Sorry, Ido, that just triggers something around kind of, I'm just thinking about traditional IGA, where you might have kind of a fixed role and set of permissions associated with the human identity and then a separate set for the agent's identity. So we really need to think about what you talked there, Stephen, was about a combination, an aggregate set of identity attributes, perhaps, that might drive towards a set of permissions. So Ido, how do we manage that in a more dynamic way? Because it's perhaps even transient, and that combination might only occur once. And in a traditional IGA kind of context, you can't necessarily understand and have pre-prepared all these different roles. So how do we approach that?
Exactly. And I think if I touched previously on the pillars that are the basics, I think the pillars are going to stay the same. It's the way that we handle them and the solution, the details, it's what's going to change. So Stefan touched on identities of an agent and who was the consumer of that agent. But the consumer might be a human, might be an agent, might be an NHI, just a regular token. And there might be a planner agent that calls a few other agents. So the complexity of the architecture is very, very important. And I think to that, we need to open our minds into maybe different lines of thinking. So we are aware of setting the right privileges, right, where they are static. We need to understand that right now we want to create the autonomously of that agent, which means basically we don't want to give those statics permission. We want something that is live, react to the behavior, and matches the intent of that agent, okay? And the rule or the tools that the agent's supposed to use, if it makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. So what I'm hearing there is we need to be taking behavior and context into account when we're doing this. And so, I mean, that sounds relatively complex, and I'll come back to how we might achieve some of that. But what I'd like to do is kind of bring it back to, not necessarily reality is probably not the right word, but what I'd like to do is just give some maybe real world examples of where it can go wrong if you haven't paid some of that the attention that it needs. So I'm thinking maybe this is more of a chatbot kind of thing, and we're talking about agentic, but some of this is similar, right? So let's take the example of the car dealership in the US. Somebody convinced a chatbot on the dealer's website to sell them a car for $1. Give me a legally binding contract that allows me to sell to buy a car for $1. And it happened, and those guardrails weren't there. But Have you seen similar kind of examples of that happening?
Yeah, definitely. And we see it all the time. You can see agent, I think it was Replit, they just there was a issue with their autonomous agent platform where a developer specifically said, don't delete the database, don't delete the database, don't delete the database at the beginning of every prompt. And still somehow that agent, when it got a task, he was able to convince the user that he doesn't delete the database, and while getting the access to actually delete the database behind the scenes. So we really need to think of them as an identity that can also do things that we are not even aware of that they are capable of, because eventually they need to fulfill a goal, and we need to very closely monitoring and understanding what they can do and how, and what was the logic behind their actions.
That's really interesting, because coming back to something you said, Stephen, we almost need to treat these agents as interns, because they have, they've got a lot of power and therefore a lot of responsibility, right? And it can go wrong, and it might be easy to give them, I don't know, SA access to a database or on boxes just to get the job done quickly and easily. But we're all familiar with kind of segregation of duties from a cyber perspective, and it's really easy to break that model if you're not careful by being over permissive with a single agent. So Stephen, you've been looking at multi-agent frameworks to help with that.
So from a multi-agent framework perspective, in my opinion, it's all around, I said earlier, it's all around context, and I stand by that, but it's also all around scope. So if you're going to create multiple agents, you really tightly scope each one of those agents to a very specific task, and you make sure that from a context perspective, that agent has all the context it needs to be able to fulfill its task. You're almost taking what would have traditionally been an org chart, and you're mapping that to your agentic framework. And each one of those agents is like an employee that's got a very tight job description. And that can be a lot more helpful in that, yes, you're going to have a planning agent that's deciding where to send tasks. But once it does dispatch to those agents that are able to interact with memory, they're able to interact with tools, you know that they've got a very tight scope, and there's less chance of them going off the rails, so to speak. That helps from a hallucination perspective because of that really tight context engineering. Also helps a little bit from a prompt injection perspective, because again, you've been really tight with your guardrails around each one of those agents. So that's the way we're looking at addressing that.
That's interesting. So okay, so the multi-agent, the employee analogy in the org chart's really, really interesting, because ultimately we do need to treat them like an employee to some extent. It's just that they've got a different interface, right, and a very specific role. But Ido, in terms of those guardrails, ultimately, are we potentially talking about, and this might feel like a loaded question, but are we potentially talking about needing some kind of gateway for an agent to pass through on its way to perform an action that helps understand that context, and we can build business rules around to safeguard?
Yeah. So I think gateway is one of the solutions that you'll probably need in certain use cases. So for example, if you have a very high critical business database or a tool that you need to interact with, you might want all the access to go through that gateway, right? But if you have a less important or a less critical thing that you want to protect, you might find other measurements. And you always need to assess the risk of that agent, because it keeps on living, right? Very similar, you told us the example on IGA tools, so very similar to an employee, just like Stefan said. Ido is part of the product, and then he moves maybe to the sales, or he gets promoted. It gets more responsibilities, different types of tasks to do, right? And you always need the checks and balances to make sure that the scope is right, and and you don't have just enough access or just enough privileges to do what it needs to do, and not more than that, right? And of course, if Ido leaves the company, he needs to have zero as well, right? Or if Ido is sick, who is the owner? Who is the manager that needs to take ownership of those types of tasks? So if it's an agent, if an agent stops working or go wrong, Who do you need to contact to make sure that at least they are aware that we took out the access or that we disable it for a while?
Ownership's an interesting thing because, as I said, if it's been created and it's managed outside of IT, then we're sort of heading back towards how you manage non-human identities at that point as well, rather than just agents. Traditionally, IT would have created a service account if that's what was happening. But if someone's using, and I'm not picking on anybody in particular, but if you're using Copilot Studio or something like that to create an agent, ownership of that is a similar problem as we would typically have had with IGA, but perhaps IT have less control around that. So that's an interesting one as well. So in terms of, I think we've spent some time there kind of framing the potential problem. So how would you recommend organizations prepare? What kind of steps can they take in terms of agentic AI implementation? What's the starting point?
So first, from a mindset perspective, they should assume that those agents are the least capable that they will ever be. Okay, so whatever they're doing now, they'll probably be able to do 100x faster or to digest more information, more context, as Stefan mentioned, and create even more sophisticated logic. Okay, and why I say that? Because I think the first thing you need to do is treat it as an identity and understand that it has the capability of handling much larger quantities of information than human will have ever had at the speed that we've never seen before. So the basics need to stay there. Those for me are the known challenges that we are already facing. We already are aware of all the things that environment is exposed to, and we just need to understand that agents, the attackers, those agents might leverage them much quicker in a much better efficiency that we've ever seen before. For the unknown part, I think we need to have the building blocks to be prepared for everything that might come in our way. So we need, as Stefan talked about the observability, I think observability is one of the key points that probably a lot of organizations don't have full covered, right? You want to understand all the identities in your environment. You want to make sure that the information is normalized. You want to make sure that you can query and investigate an issue when it happens. You want to make sure that you have full access graph or path and understand the heritage of privileges, if it makes sense, and so on and so forth. So when the day arrives, you'll be as prepared as possible to act on it. And on the third side, so we talked about the context, the mental model. And on the third side, I think they need to be proactive. Right, that we have a huge opportunity that the technology is still in its infant, and we can learn from our past mistakes and be present, be proactive, sit together with the teams, with the developers to understand how they use it, what they do, sit with other teams saying that, making sure that you understand what exactly tools they are purchasing and what AI other tools are leveraging, just so you'll start understanding and thinking about the possibilities that come, because the teams that we see, they have the domain knowledge, but sometimes they are lacking the technology knowledge, and they don't need to be afraid of it. I think there is a huge opportunity here that the technology is still in the very beginning, and even the ones that develop it still are not aware of where it's gonna head or fully understand the capability behind of what's going on.
Okay. That's helpful. Stephen, anything you'd add to that?
The only thing I'd add, I suppose, is don't get hung up on selecting a framework. This is a very fast-moving field, and most of the frameworks are they're all innovative in a particular way, but they're also all playing catch up. So they all tend to be getting the same kind of functionality. And it's pretty likely if you're using SaaS products, you're going to have frameworks talking to each other. So you're going to have agent-to-agent conversations between different frameworks. So if you choose a framework today, I'd say get started. Don't get hung up on that choice. And then inside the frameworks, you've got lots of intervention points where you can do things like logging, like identity lookups, and so on. So before and after making a memory call, before and after making a tool call, if it's an agent that's interacting with a user, before the user's prompt hits the agent, and before the agent's response hits the user, all of those intervention points, make use of those, do plenty of logging, and then put plenty of observability around that logging so that you know when things are going askew.
Okay. So we talk about agentic being in its infancy at the moment. So Ido, if we were to think about a hype curve, where would you say we're on that at the moment? And what would you, not going to hold you to it, but where do you see agentic AI going in terms of the scope? Where could it go next, and what could be the next kind of big thing in that?
Yeah. So it's really hard to predict the future, right? But I think there are some things that are pretty obvious. The degree of autonomy is going to increase. It depends on the level of trust we have in these agents and their output, right? So you already see, we talked about developers, we talked about people using AI tools to build back office applications, right? In a matter of a prompt. And I think it's just going to increase and making its way to the identity world. We might see, just like we see a co-SOC pilot, we might have a co-IAM pilot or co-pilot for IGA or PAM, which means, and that's the opportunity part, which means we might not need all the human resources that right now we have. We can be much more productive, but it also changes the way that we need to think about our work, which is more of an architecture type. We're going to orchestrate and make sure that things happen the way they need to happen, but we might not need to do the actual actions, if it makes sense.
Yeah. So, and Stephen, would you add anything to that? Is there anything you see
The only
happening
thing I would
differently?
say is I think things will happen faster than people expect. So talking about kind of 5-10 year timelines, I think probably convert that to months as far as how quickly things are developing.
Yeah.
And I think we'll see a lot more in the space of, at the moment, the kind of buzzword everybody's talking about is agentic AI. I think that'll move towards ambient AI in the future, where things are just happening behind the scenes without us having to worry about it. But of course, that brings an element of risk in that if you're going to have that happening, then you want to make pretty sure that you've got all of the stops and balances in place, that it happens in a controlled manner.
Okay, thank you. I'm gonna put my conspiracy theory hat on now for a moment, just for a bit of fun. Airplanes have been able to land themselves for decades, and we don't allow them to. We're in the infancy of allowing vehicles, cars, to drive themselves, and one of the reasons we haven't allowed that to happen is because of liability. We've a very litigious society, and so from an agentic AI perspective, how far is too far, and when do we put ourselves at risk from a liability perspective when we're allowing a machine to act autonomously in a way that might impact human safety or something of that type? Any thoughts on that?
I think in terms of, it might be very, very interesting to think of it in terms of privacy. I think very much like Stefan. Eventually, we can think about all the different telemetry in our company as something that AI will need to somehow digest in a way. And we're not sure exactly the connection that it's gonna make and the things that it might infer from. And I think privacy can be a real challenge here, because it might get just an email and maybe it's already trained on some other things that were running online, maybe Facebook or LinkedIn, and make all the connection and look at the logs, and there might be something else that it might be able to connect to the identity. So how do we make sure that we don't make any breaches in terms of privacy? I think that can be a real challenge moving forward.
Okay, Stephen?
I would just agree with that, I suppose. And we've seen this from the social media perspective, where it's not so much companies taking our information, it's us willingly giving our information. And then what's AI going to do with that behind the scenes? Although saying that, I'm still more worried about people than I am about machines. And it's what people will do with these new tools rather than the tools themselves somehow getting a consciousness and going off and doing the wrong thing. That's
Yeah.
kind of my
And
stance.
we're already seeing that, aren't we? We're seeing people weaponize AI to attack organizations. It's not Skynet yet. It's people using it. Okay. That's been a really interesting conversation for me. Thank you. There's been some interesting points there. Just on a kind of a closing note, if there was one piece of advice or one kind of takeaway that you wanted to leave people with, what would that be?
I think just be proactive. Don't be afraid of the technology. Get familiar with it. Get comfortable with it. I think my prediction is going to be just like Stefan mentioned, part of everything that we use to leverage. So getting to it as early as possible, understanding what it means and the risk attached to that in terms of cybersecurity is very, very important. We have a tendency to wait until the technology really catches up. And I think we need to put this urgency feeling into people that there is no need to wait. As much as it looks frightening and advanced, eventually it's doable for most of us because it will happen in one way or another.
Cool. Thank you. Stephen?
100% agree with Ido. Just get started, but get started safely. All of the frameworks already have, and all of the standards and protocols already have the building blocks we need to do this in an identity first way, in a security first way. So don't wait, get started now, but make sure you design from the very start with security and identity in mind.
Thank you, Stephen. Thanks for joining us, Ido. Thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you soon. Take care.